Our gospel reading this morning is taken from Matthew's account of Jesus' life, the 16th chapter. Out of reverence for the words and the works of Jesus, I invite you to stand for the reading of the gospel. In this reading, Jesus' training of his disciples reaches a turning point when, in contrast to the crowds, they begin to understand his true identity and purpose. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I invite you all to be seated. We are fascinated by the idea of inside information. Aren't we? Have you ever thought about this? I thought about it this week when I saw a little ad pop up in my news feed that said, "Leading cardiologists beg people not to eat this food." And it showed a picture of blueberries, and I thought, it's hard to believe that blueberries would be a problem. So I almost clicked on it, but then I thought, then again, it's hard to believe that leading cardiologists would beg people to do anything. I've known quite a few doctors, and I could believe that a leading cardiologist might design a clinical experiment to test the effect of a certain food, that they might release the study results to a peer-reviewed journal, and that perhaps on the basis of that published study that they might be interviewed by major media. But I can't really believe that leading cardiologists would beg people through an internet ad not to eat a certain food. And it kind of echoes, though, the fact that this is something advertisers know. They know that we are really attracted by the idea of inside information. And it's not just advertising, is it either? It's television programs, right? The basis for a lot of those is inside information. Anybody remember the X-Files? Right? It was all about this idea that there was hidden information, and pretty much anything on the History Channel, right? Secrets of the Mayan tombs, right? Could they have been built by aliens? No, that's the conclusion. But you got to watch it for 2 hours to get there. And of course, we're drowning in conspiracy theories. And conspiracy theories are all about what? Inside information, right? They make you feel a part of a group that knows something that nobody else knows. But they're all generally fiction. Except that our reading for today is not fiction. And it's not actually meant to be inside information. It's actually something that's meant to change the world and to change our lives now that we're not only told we can, but we ought to publicly proclaim what the disciples spent a couple years figuring out. See, the setting of our reading for today is Caesarea Philippi. It's probably the most pagan place Jesus ever visited. It was built by Herod's son Philip, so he named it after himself, but also he wanted to honor Caesar, so Caesarea Philippi. And yet, it was popularly known, and to this day is known by its earlier name, which is Paneas, because it had a temple to the Greek god Pan there, and a grotto, and actually temples to all sorts of pagan gods. Jesus was outside of Israel, in this pagan place. It was natural for this question to come up. Who do people say I am? And so the disciples answered, well, some say that you're John the Baptist. Herod had recently killed John, and some thought that Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Other people remembered that the Old Testament said that Elijah would return before the day of the Lord. So some people thought he was Elijah. Some people thought he was Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. But then Jesus asks a more personal and more important question. He asks, who do you say that I am? Because the disciples have been traveling around with Jesus for 2 years. They'd heard his teachings. They'd seen his miracles. And Peter pipes up and says, you are the Christ. That is the Messiah, the anointed one that was promised. And then he goes on to say, the Son of the living God. And that was inside information. Because the Jewish people all believed that the Messiah would come in some way, shape, or form. But the idea that the Messiah would also be the Son of God, this was something it took 2 years for the disciples to understand. And from this, I want to just pull out 3 essential teachings of Christianity that to this day seem to be inside information. But they're things that we now know and understand. And the first one is that God's Son came to earth. Now, if you were raised a Christian, this is something that you take for granted. But we probably shouldn't, because more and more people don't understand this. More and more people, they know the name Jesus. They know that he was a celebrity religious leader. Many of them think of him as a good teacher, some even as a prophet. But he was more than that. We understand that he was actually the Son of God. That is, the person of God put into human flesh in order to save us, because we couldn't save ourselves. And this is revolutionary because it tells us something about God. It tells us that he loves us enough to be personally involved in the course of human history. Again, he's not sitting out on the far side of the universe waiting to see what happens. But he had predicted, he had planned for. He didn't take away free will, but he used human free will in order to bring about our salvation through the gift of his own Son. C.S. Lewis, in his famous book, Mere Christianity, makes a strong point of this. He argues that because Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and you really can't read the Gospels without understanding that Jesus came to be the Son of God. And in fact, if you have a background in Judaism, it really stands out that he had claimed to be the Son of God. And because of that, you could have a couple of options, really. One is that Jesus was lying. Right? He was a liar. If he was a liar, he was the greatest liar the world has ever seen, right? Because literally 1 billion people or more, actually more like 2 billion now, believed that he was the Son of God. So he was a great liar, but what did he have to stand to gain from this lie? Because in Jewish culture, to claim to be God or the Son of God meant that you were writing your own death sentence. The Jewish leaders would immediately condemn you for blasphemy, and blasphemy was punishable by death. And Jesus didn't seem to get rich off of this, right? He didn't seem to get power off of this. He remained vulnerable, but he claimed to be the Son of God. So it seems unlikely that he was out and out intentionally lying. Another possibility is he was a lunatic, right? Because there are a lot of crazy people that claim to be Jesus, right? And nowadays, they actually can attract followings. And it could be, except that he doesn't say other delusional things that you would expect a crazy person to say. In fact, Jesus' teachings are renowned even by people outside the church as containing phenomenal wisdom. And you don't generally find that in crazy people. So C.S. Lewis concludes there is a third option, and that is that he was the Lord, that he was who he said he was. And if that's the case, then we can't ignore it. It makes a huge difference in our lives, in our understanding of God, in our understanding of what this life is all about. I heard a story years ago. It was kind of an apocryphal story, meaning I'm not sure whether it was true or not. But there was a guy who bought one of the early Model Ts. And one day he was driving it down the dirt road near his house in Michigan, and he hit a pothole, and it stopped. something had broken, gone out of adjustment. He could not figure out how to get it going. He worked on it for an hour, and he was extremely frustrated when another Model T came down the road, and a kind of distinguished-looking gentleman got out and asked him about it, and he explained what had happened, and the gentleman said, "Do you mind if I give it a try?" And he said, "No, go ahead." And that gentleman tinkered with it for a few minutes, and immediately then was able to start the Model T. And he went on his way, but the next day he was talking to a friend, and he described the incident, and the friend said, "Well, do you know who that was?" And he said, "No, I have no idea." He said, "That was Henry Ford." And whether it's true or not, this is kind of an image of the Christian gospel, isn't it? That our Creator stopped and came into human history in order to fix what we couldn't fix. And I find that tremendously comforting and tremendously revealing about God. But here's the thing. In Jesus' response to Peter, he not only affirms that this is true, but he also affirms something else, and that is that the reign of death is ended. Jesus praises Peter and says, "For this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." And then Jesus makes a pun. Now, for those of you who hate puns, I apologize, but they're in the Bible. Jesus made puns, so don't be groaning. Jesus says, "You are Petros," which means a small rock. "And upon this Petra," which means bedrock or a foundation stone, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it." It's one of the very few times that Jesus actually uses the word that we translate church, which meant an assembly or a congregation of citizens. And he talks about the church knocking on the gates of Hades. I don't know if you've ever thought about the implication of that, but what it means is that we are on the offense, not the defense. And I say that because a lot of people in the church today are very defensive. They feel like, oh, the world is attacking Christianity, and honestly, we should be attacking back, but not for the sake of morals, not by being bitter or mean-spirited or harsh or anything that we seem to find so common in culture. We fight back with the gospel. We fight back with the acceptance of Jesus Christ and the love of Jesus Christ and the message that the God who created this world cared enough about every single one of his creatures that he was willing to sacrifice his own life for us. But that's how we fight back. That's what knocks on the gates of Hades. Satan loves it when we join him in battle against each other. And he loves it when we join him in battle against innocent bystanders, people who just don't have the same inside information that we have. But he hates it when we share the nature of Jesus, not only in our words, but in our actions, in our character, so that they can't ignore the idea that there is a loving God who sacrificed his own will for us. He loves it. That's what God sent us here to do. I don't know how many of you have seen the first Star Wars movie. Raise your hand if you've seen the first Star Wars movie. Yeah, most of you haven't. Honestly, it's been out almost 50 years now, so if I'm spoiling it for you, I'm sorry. But you've had a chance. You remember the first Star Wars movie when Han and Luke get sucked into the Death Star, right? And they have to figure out a way to escape from the Death Star, and it seems kind of hopeless, except they're ultimately able to do that because Obi-Wan does what? He sacrifices his own life. And that enables them to escape. But while they're there, Luke discovers that Princess Leia is also on the Death Star and that she's about to be executed. And she talks Han and Chewie into going and rescuing Princess Leia, so that what became about escape, what was about escape, became a rescue. And you know, the first time I saw this movie, it was in the theater. I was in my teens. I wasn't really thinking about Christology then. But isn't that also the nature of the Christian gospel? That what started out to be an escape, our escape from death, our escape from condemnation and shame, once we understand the gospel, becomes a rescue mission. We actually love people that we've never even met. Maybe not the same way Luke loved Leia, but we love people enough to risk our lives to rescue them. That's the business of the church. That's what they're here for. And I say that that's inside information because in our culture, a lot of people feel, well, it's okay to be a Christian as long as you don't talk to anybody else about it. Right? As long as you don't go pushing your religion on me or anybody else for that matter. You should just keep it quiet. It should be a private thing. Christianity has never been a private thing. It was never meant to be a private thing. It's meant to be the salvation of the world, but it can't be the salvation of the world unless the church understands that that's its mission. That that's what the church is about. We're not a private club. We're not a castle. Okay, we call it where we meet a sanctuary. But we leave and go out into the world to knock on the gates of Hades, to rescue people and prevent them from eternal death, from eternal separation from God. That's what we're about. Once we understand what God has done for us, we share that secret with other people. And the other thing that this tells us that is in Jesus' response is that our actions matter in eternity. It's not just here on earth. Jesus says to Peter, I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. When I was little, I thought the office of the keys was maybe a closet in the church where they kept all of the keys, right? But now I know it refers to this verse. The office of the keys is the office that's been entrusted to us to act on Jesus' behalf. And what we do here matters in heaven. It matters in eternity. When we announce the forgiveness of sins to people, when we share with them God's love in our actions and our words and all the different ways that Paul described in our epistle, it matters in eternity, whether we do that or not. And this is inside information that's meant to be public, right? That this is what the church is about, that we believe what we do matters not just in the here and now, but in the there and then. And it changes us when we have that understanding. How many of you remember when Martha Stewart was convicted of insider trading? 2004. I looked that up this past week because I couldn't remember the details. The problem was she sold $230,000 worth of stock in a company called Imclone. And she sold it the day before the FDA announced that they were rejecting a new cancer drug that Imclone was putting out. The day before, their stock prices tumbled 16%. And she saved herself $45,000 by selling this stock. And it turned out that she sold it the day after she had met with her close friend, the CEO of Imclone. And that got the Securities and Exchange Commission's attention. And so she was tried a couple of years later. She was ultimately convicted of what's called insider trading because it was unfair that she used information that other people didn't have in order to prevent her loss or to gain profit. And that's the problem with insider trading. It's not that you can't have relationships with close friends and get stock tips from them. It's that it has to be public information. You can't leverage your inside information for just your advantage. And I want to say, I think that she kind of learned that lesson because she was in prison, for 5 months. Do you know what she did in prison while she was there, among other things? She taught classes for other inmates on how to start your own business. That's kind of inside information, isn't it? Not everybody knows how to do that. But if these inmates are going to get out and start a new life, it's valuable. And it's something that she knew that they didn't. And see, this is kind of how the gospel changes us, right? It changes us because this inside information that Christ died for us enables us, encourages us, urges us to share what we know with other people. That's what the gospel does. That's how it's spread throughout the world. That's why we exist. In Jesus' name, amen.